So chapter 13, we went through how the spies went out. We talked a little bit about whose plan was it. There's a little bit of insight in Deuteronomy that really puts it more on it wasn't God's original plan. Because God had already said the land was flowing with milk and honey and it was a great place. The people were thinking, we're not real sure, let's make double sure. And so God allowed them to have the 12 spies go out. And they weren't just any Joe Schmoes. I mean, they were leaders of each of the tribes. So, but they didn't have the faith, that was the bottom line, that God was able to do it. So there was a minority and majority report. It kind of shows that, the majority is not always right. On that note, just Friday night, apparently, they passed a bill in our legislature, which they have been passing a lot of bills. And one of them on there's no discrimination against sexual orientation. There used to be in it a phrase that says, this does not include pedophilia. They took that out. So does that mean you can't fire a teacher? I mean, what is it? You can't discriminate against, because that's now considered an orientation. I mean, when you lose a biblical perspective on things, you have a downward slope.
The snowball rolls down.
It's the snowball rolls down. Yeah, and the domino effect takes place too. So, the majority isn't always right. Unfortunately, unfortunately, what a group or the majority of the population now, whatever is legal must be right, must be moral. That's their mentality. They don't have a backup of scripture. So where did they travel? They traveled throughout all the land. And some people estimate that they went 250 miles each way in 40 days. I mean, they were in good shape. Maybe they were on Ray Vanderlin's tours, going around, but that's pretty amazing. So these guys were tough, rough and ready. But when they came back, of course, the mob mentality took over too. The people cried, oh no, we're not going to be able to go. Let's go back to Egypt. And amazing that they wanted to stone Joshua and Caleb for telling the truth. I mean, here's another example of persecution of true believers. Now, Moses becomes an intercessor again. He's done that again and again, and he's pleaded with God, and God hears him. And God's end game, remember, is, like Ray Vanderlin always points out in his series, is that Israel was to be a beacon and to be a light to the rest of the world about the graciousness of God. And God's end game is, as truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of God. And that's what you see in Revelation, where that happens. But God's plan has always been that. Really the people didn't have an excuse. They had seen so much that had taken place. Remember, this is the generation that went out of Egypt, saw the 10 plagues, saw the Passover, crossing the Red Sea, saw the water from the rock, saw the manna, and still they were saying, what are you trying to do, Moses? Kill us? But then you have to look, would I have gone along with the crowd? Well, maybe, just to go along to get along type of thing, which is not good either. So they get the punishment. Now, there are degrees of judgment. We saw that, and Jesus said that if certain miracles had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented. And so, woe unto you, Bethsaida and Chorazin, because you saw all of these things and you didn't believe. So the punishment, though, was ironic. Okay, for every day the spies went out, you're gonna spend a year in the wilderness. And everybody over 20 was gonna die, except Caleb and Joshua. Aaron was gonna die, Miriam was gonna die, Moses was gonna die even. I mean, Moses was not at fault, Moses was another deal. But then the people disobey again. Oh, they said, oh, we're sorry. But they weren't really repenting. They were repenting, they were sorry for the consequence. So they said, guess what, Moses? We're gonna go do it now. And Moses said, it's not gonna work. It's not gonna happen. The ark's not gonna go with you. The priests aren't gonna go with you. I'm not gonna go with you, but good luck. And they went anyways, and they got their tails whipped. They came back, you know, just beaten and a lot of them killed. And they said, oh, God means business. And that's, you know, a problem in our lives, and I know, and, that sometimes we're sorry for the consequence, but not repentant of the sin. So the bottom line is, without God's help, we're not going to do well. And they weren't going to defeat all of these Canaanites that had iron chariots and were warlike, you know, just on their own. Remember, they had been slaves. They were not trained in warfare. It was because of God's grace that He allows them 40 years later to go in to the land. Okay, so that is so I had a little interesting note, and I was reading today because we're doing 1 Samuel in Children's Church, and I was reading ahead. And you remember when the ark is stolen, and the Philistines say, "Oh, great, you know, we got the ark. Let's put it in our temple with Dagon." And Dagon falls down, you know, and prostrate in front of the ark. And then they put him back up. Oh, it must have been on, you know, something. The cat came by and knocked it over, you know. And then it fell over again, and his arms and legs and head were off. They said, "Oh." And then they get a plague. It was probably the bubonic plague, because it's associated with tumors and rats. And so then they went to their priests and they said, "What should we do?" And I thought the interesting thing was here, you're saying, what does this have to do with us? That what the priests are saying is, now this is 300 years after the Exodus. The priests say, don't mess with this God. He's the God that destroyed Egypt. Do this, this, and this, and get it back to them. Get rid of it, and put in some offerings for their God. I think God was gracious to the Philistines, because they were operating out of ignorance in a lot of ways. But it's so interesting. I mean, this is without media. This is without the internet to Google, you know, 300 years ago what was happening. This was oral tradition, and it was probably written down too somewhere. And we saw that when Jericho too. Remember Rahab's testimony? She's saying, "We've heard about you guys, and we're scared stiff." So God, you know, allowed that to happen.
Well, the other option is they took the calves away from the cows.
Yes.
And said, "We'll see if this really is."
Yeah.
And I think the cows went away reluctantly, but they went.
Yeah, but they went right back to Israel.
Yeah.
And what did the cows get for that? They got butchered and sacrificed. So think of those poor little calves left behind. But that's an interesting point too. They set up a little test. Okay, if this is just coincidence, but it wasn't. You know, I thought it was funny too that so the ark's in one town, and the leaders of that town say, "Let's send it over to the next town." And they say, "We don't want it. Get it out of here." So Okay, so Numbers 15, if you want to turn there, we're just going to kind of summarize this one, because there's not a lot of, but the theme of this is the penalties for Sabbath breaking, and God's purpose is not destroyed. So it's kind of an interim between what happened in 14 and what's going to be happening now in 16, where it's the same song, second verse, a little bit louder, a little bit worse. So he gives a lot of rules for offering sacrifice here. Now, you think, well, why did they have to give all these rules? Well, they didn't want the people to take habits and traditions from the Canaanites and intermix those traditions about what to do with a sacrifice. So they were very specific. You shall not do such and such. You're going to not make it, you're going to not hewn the stones, you're going to make them out of rough stones. And when the priest goes up, it's things like, it's not going to be high, because then somebody could see under his cloak, God's very specific, for good reason. Then he talks about the sins of ignorance, that there's a distinction there between sins where you didn't know, but it's still a sin. And there was a special offering for a sin of ignorance. And that was a special offering of a bull. And I just think that's interesting too, that, every sin is punishable by death in a sense, but God takes note of people that don't know. And I think that's, J. Vernon McGee writes, though, ignorance is no excuse, though, for rejecting Christ. We are all lost because we are sinners and born with a carnal nature. All men are lost. The Bible says Christ came to seek and to save the lost. Everyone is lost. That, we always hear the argument against Christianity. What about those in Africa that never heard? Well, I would just say, I don't know, but I know that God is just and fair. And God will deal with that. But we've heard stories too where people cry out to God. God is there. But people love darkness rather than light. And why does John say, why is that true? Because their deeds were evil. That when people's deeds are evil, that shapes their thinking. I know Gothard used to say, that a man's theology is more shaped by, or his man's morality is not shaped so much by his theology as by his morality. And then they talk about these tassels, and we've seen Ray Vanderlyn, they put one on today, I just got it, and you can buy them on Amazon. Of course, you can buy anything on Amazon. So they would wear these tassels, and Ray Vanderlyn, if you noticed in his videos, he's always wearing a tassel. And that the Jews would wear this, and the blue was to remind you that you represent God. And it's a reminder to live in a way that's pleasing to Him. And I thought that's pretty cool. I gave one of these to Steve today too, so he's wearing it. So you see, maybe. Well, let's not be judgmental. So
is it, they call it, they should put on the tassel in each corner a cord of blue, so that was the tassel, and the tassel itself
yeah,
was the blue, wasn't just tied on.
yeah, just hooked onto their belt, I guess. Or stapled on that.
And you're supposed to remember all the commandments of the Lord. You got that down now?
Yeah. But, it is, even sometimes I think, when Catholics have prayer beads, that's not all bad. It's just to have that as a reminder, that each bead represents a person or whatever who you're praying for. That's not a bad practice. Okay. Now, the other thing that is in this chapter is talking about the death penalty for breaking the Sabbath. Now, for us today, that seems kind of extreme. But God was setting up a culture that was going to be different from all of the rest of the Canaanites, and that was part of it, to have that Sabbath rest. And as we know, having a Sabbath rest is good for your health. It's not just just an obscure thing. And when we talked about the Sabbath, we talked about the Oregon Trail people, that those groups that said, we're going to honor Sunday, we're going to rest on our cattle and our people one day a week. And there were other groups that said, no way, we're going to get there right away, we're going to go. And then they would pass them along the way with broken down, wagons, oxen that were dead. And then they would beg them, please let us go with you. So,
Well, on the farm, we never worked on Sunday. At
okay,
least my dad.
except to milk the cows.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
no field work.
Feed the chickens, right?
Yeah.
Except for the cows.
Right. The cows didn't believe in the Sabbath.
No, they just made a lot of racket.
They didn't have a switch to turn it off and on.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and you didn't want them to go dry.
No,
No, that was your bread and butter, right?
Well,
Okay.
butter.
Yeah,
At least-
Well, butter.
yeah, no better. So, chapter 16. Now, the main theme of this is if you rebel against God's appointed authority, you're rebelling against God. And I was thinking when I read this, didn't we just deal with this a few times? Now, it's not an exact timeline here apparently, so it's taking place sometime during that 40-year wandering. It might not have been the next day, we don't know. It might have been, a few years down the road. And in all of chapters 16 through 19 are all dealing with things like this and dealing with the priesthood and why the priesthood was important. Now, the Aaronic priesthood is not around for the church. That's not part of the deal. If you know anything about Mormonism, they have priesthoods, and they have the Aaronic priesthood, and then they have Melchizedek priesthood, for the real higher ups. And there's no, New Testament deal to say that should be going on. So let's read verses 1 through 3 in chapter 16, if somebody could get that.
Korah, son of Ishkar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, and certain Reubenites, Dathan and Abiram, their sons of Gilead, and On, son of Peleth, became insolent, and rose up against Moses. With them were 250 Israelite men, well-known community leaders, who had been appointed members of the council. They came as a group to oppose Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You have gone too far. The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why then do you set yourselves up above the Lord's assembly?"
Okay, so that kind of sets the scene. I like that version where it said they're insolent. That's a word we don't use much. You might have used that with some teenagers sometimes. But, so they're saying, you know what, Moses, you're not the only one.
And they were jealous.
And they were jealous. Now, Jay Vernon says this is the 5th murmuring recorded. But the interesting thing is it's led by prominent men. These aren't just the ragamuffin guys that are, looking for trouble, necessarily. They're leaders in the community, 250 of them, and they're led by Korah, who was a Levite. His co-conspirators now are Dathan. You know, if you remember watching the Ten Commandments movie, of course they go way beyond scripture. They portray Dathan as by using Edward G. Robinson as Dathan. And of course, Edward G. Robinson is always portrayed as the bad guy in all of the movies. You know, he's the guy that's a you dirty rat, you know. So, and then Abram, who was, and then some sons of Reuben. Now, why is, I was thinking, why is that significant? Well, Reuben, he was the firstborn, wasn't he, of the 12. But he got lowered a number of notches because, remember, he had an affair with one of the concubines, one of the maids of, who was actually the mother of some of the men. He had an affair with her. And at Jacob's end of his life, he said, you know, because of that, you've lost your firstborn standing. It's going to be Joseph, the firstborn of Rachel, even though Joseph was the 11th in line, you know, as far as birth order. So they're probably thinking, you know, we really got gypped. You know, we're the firstborn. We should have more say in all of this. Why don't you contact me, you know, and get our advice? So I'm sure they felt slighted. So there are 250 other important princes. So this is not a small affair. And it must have been planned out. When you think about it, they didn't just decide, oh, why don't we go? No, they said, we're going to do this. So all that extra time that they had in the tents, you know, waiting around for, and I think what they said was these guys were probably all on one side of the camp. Remember, they're divided into 4 sections. That Reuben was with a lot of the Levites, so they probably had time to intermix and you know, and rebellion is contagious. So, but the point too is Moses was not taking on more than he wanted. You know, if you had asked Moses, and that was the theme all along, you know, would you do this? Well, I don't think I'm qualified. No, let somebody else do it. So, and the charges were false. Moses was not on some power trip trying to, you know, be the #1 guy. If he had any choice in it, he would have said, I'd rather just go back to Midian, be with my father-in-law and herd some sheep. You know, they don't argue much. So Moses had certainly been through the school of hard knocks. He had a doctorate in the school of hard knocks, I think. So he was used to this though, wasn't he? But it's still hard. So Korah and his buddies, like John said, were very jealous. So the point here too is we are to walk in humility and recognize all authority comes from God. Moses actually realized that. And, you know, if we want to function in a church, as a body, we're not to be jealous of others. You know, and Paul brings that out, and everybody's gift is different. You know, the eye can't say to the toe, you know, I don't have need of you. Yeah, you do. Because everybody's different, everybody has something to offer. And Steve was talking about that in his sermons. So many home, work, and church problems stem from jealousy. When you think about that in your experience in life, when jealousy happens, it can get ugly.
Amen.
Yeah. You think of at work. Well, why did he get, you know, to do that? Why did he get the promotion? Or it's not a big deal thing, but I had a friend, well, I had a lot of friends there but one guy would talk with our principals. He was this black man that had a Jaguar, and so he would he was talking to Willie at lunch. He was on luncheon duty. He said, "Hey, Willie, can I use your car this afternoon to go get something?" Willie said, "Sure, go ahead." You know. And one of the other guys heard that. He says, "Why doesn't he let me do that?" So even on petty things like that, we can become jealous. So these guys did not get it, and they had a short memory. These are still probably the men that have gone through the Red Sea, and Passover, and all of that. So, and they're in for big trouble. They don't see that coming down the pike. So let's read verses 4 through 7. Moses' response.
When Moses heard this, he fell on his face. And he spoke to Korah and all his company, saying, "Tomorrow morning the Lord will show you who is his, and who is holy, and will bring him near to himself, even the one whom he will choose. He will bring near to himself. Do this, take censers for yourself, Korah, and all your company, put fire in them, and lay incense upon them in the presence of the Lord tomorrow. And the man whom the Lord chooses shall be the one who is holy. You have gone far enough, you sons of Levi."
So he didn't respond like, he didn't fight back and say, "Oh yeah? Well, what about when I did this and this?" No. He just said, God's going to decide this. If you think you're really right, okay, we'll put it in God's hands. And sometimes we're not to defend ourselves. I mean, I know that's a tendency in my life. You want to defend yourself, just rather than sit back and say. I think Gothard used to say too that every criticism probably has a kernel of truth in it. And you need to look at that. So Moses gives a little warning. He says, "You know what? You're taking on way too much, and you're going to regret it." So they're going to get the censers, which were, I was kind of imagining something like kind of in a Catholic church, and they're walking down with the censers with the incense. And they were made out of brass, and that's going to be important later on. And they're blind to it, aren't they? They're saying, yeah, we'll do that. So then in verses 8 through 11, Moses, actually gives them a little bit of kudos. He says, "Hey, you Levites, God has given you a special job too. You're a Levite. You get to work in the tabernacle. You each have different jobs of carrying things and setting things up. You're important too. But now you're seeking the priesthood, and the priests were a special division of the Levites. God has not ordained that. And why are you murmuring against Aaron? He's the high priest. He's no gem." I'm surprised a little bit that Aaron and Miriam didn't speak up at this point and talk to everybody and say, "You know what? We tried this. It doesn't turn out well." Maybe they did, and it was no avail. So then verses 15 through 17, Moses, understandably, he gets a little frustrated, and he appeals to God for his help. So Moses sets up a little test, and I thought of Elijah on Mount Carmel too. Okay, you guys go first. We'll see what happens. If fire comes down and takes your offering, good, then Baal's real. But then, of course, Elijah got a little bit sarcastic, like, hey guys, where's your God? Is he sleeping? Is he going to the bathroom? But he did say, we're going to let God decide. And like I said, I keep thinking this, that should have struck fear in their hearts. They had seen what happened to the 10 spies that opposed God. And they should have thought, you know, some of those guys, and maybe some did, maybe some said, you know, I'm out. Verses 18 through 20. Let's read that, verses 18 through 21. So I think this is God's graciousness here.
So every man took his censer, put fire in it, laid incense on it, and stood at the door of the tabernacle of meeting with Moses and Aaron. And Korah gathered all the congregation against them at the door of the tabernacle. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to the congregation. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. They fell on their faces and said, O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin, and you be angry with all the congregation? So the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the congregation, saying, get away from the tents of Korah, Nathan, and David.
Yeah, God's given them an extra warning there. If you don't want part of this now, I mean, here's my glory.
And he destroyed the whole
The
clan.
people that, the
In
people,
their tent.
yeah, if they stayed with them, they were gonna go too. I bet a lot of, I don't know, but I bet there were a number that said, see ya. I'm going way over there.
Well, some of the Psalms were written by the sons of Korah.
Yes.
So they must have left.
There was some that didn't leave. They addressed that. That's good.
Psalms 46 says,
Yeah. Yeah.
the choir master of the sons of Korah, so they were involved in the music.
They were a special Levite
Yeah.
group. Yeah,
Yeah, so they must have ran away.
yeah,
They had to.
yeah, right.
Because that really puzzled me, because when I saw that, I thought they all died.
Yeah. It indicates that,
Yeah.
yeah, but that must not have happened. And maybe the mom said,
Yeah, that's
we're
right.
out of here.
Yeah.
I'm taking Cora, I'm taking our kids. We're
Yeah.
leaving. You do what you want.
You've gone too far.
Yeah, you've gone too far. That's a scary word if a wife says to you, do what you want.
I'm trying to straighten out the ones that were involved here. Korah was involved, because I'm looking at the first verse of 16. And it's, so that was one. And then Dathan and Abiram, that's two more. And On. Is that?
And then the son, there's a bunch of Reubenites that are involved in it.
Yeah, but it says, but it mentions particularly those guys. But then
Yes.
when they're taken out over 27, Korah, Dathan, Abiram, they came out, stood at the doorway, and then they're all,
Yeah,
On is not mentioned.
maybe he left. Right, whenever you hear about this story, it's always the big three that, and we don't, like, God gave some, like you just said, you know, God gave some, a little out for some of these.
So maybe he did.
Yeah, so maybe some of them backed out, which they should have.
Because he said they assembled the whole people against him, so all those people must have ran away that were opposing originally.
Yeah, whatever number it was, right?
Whatever.
Now, in 22 through 30, Moses becomes an intercessor again. Boy, he's busy. So do not punish, he's saying, don't punish the whole population. And then Moses also says in this, you know, God's going to defend me. And then Moses warns them one more time, depart from these rebels. Don't go down that path. You know, we've told people and advice sometimes, don't do it.
I even touched this.
Yeah, don't, just in modern day terms, you see somebody, a brother in Christ, that they're gonna run away, and you say, don't do it, you're gonna regret it. And then Moses foretells what's gonna happen. God's told him what's gonna happen. I'm gonna play a little clip here. I don't think this is copyrighted. It goes in video. So this is what happens.
How to kill all mosquitoes in the area in 90 seconds. This simple but brilliant trick you can do to
Hey everyone, Eric here. In this video, I'm continuing a series on undesigned coincidences in the Old Testament. As a reminder, an undesigned coincidence is a notable connection between two or more accounts or texts that doesn't seem to have been planned by the person or the people giving the accounts. Despite their apparent independence, the items fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. An undesigned coincidence provides reason to believe that all the statements that contribute to it are truthful. Often, the undesigned coincidence can lay between two different accounts, but sometimes the detail lies within a single book. In such circumstances, it's necessary for the connection between the details to be sufficiently obscure enough to render the details independent of one another. That's going to be the case in this example that we look at today. We're going to look at an undesigned coincidence in the book of Numbers. In Numbers 16, we read about a rebellion against Moses. Let's start by reading verses 1 through 3. Now Korah, the son of Izhar, son of Kohath, son of Levi, with Dathan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, and On, son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took 250 prominent Israelite men who were leaders of the community and representatives in the assembly, and they rebelled against Moses. They came together against Moses and Aaron and told them, "You've gone too far. Everyone in the entire community is holy and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" So basically they're asking where Moses gets off with this big power trip of his. I mean, he was only chosen by God to deliver Israel from Egypt through 10 miraculous plagues and the parting of the Red Sea, but seriously, who died and made him king? Now hang on with me for just a little bit here. This is going to be like finding scattered puzzle pieces and matching them up, but the punchline will be worth it. In the passage I just read, we were told that there are two main groups responsible for this plot against Moses from two different families. Dathan, Abiram, and On come from the tribe of Reuben. The other party was Korah of the family of Kohath, who were Levites. In a completely different and totally incidental context, we're given an interesting factoid that interlocks with these verses. In Numbers 3:29, we read, "The clans of the Kohathites camped on the south side of the tabernacle." Next, in an unconnected manner, we find in Numbers 2:10 another interesting tidbit that links it all together. Reuben's military divisions will camp on the south side under their banner. If you've ever done a through the Bible in 1 year plan, these are the kinds of boring passages that your eyes will just normally glaze over at. But here we learn that the Kohath family and the Reuben family were camped on the same side of the tabernacle. So this makes them both conveniently placed for secretly conspiring together against Moses. This subtle kind of congruity between these three passages that are scattered around in Numbers might easily escape the notice of the reader. The fact that we have to dig somewhat in order to recognize these details is evidence of it being a genuine undesigned coincidence. It would be difficult for an author to produce such a coincidence and then just tuck it away. And if a writer was clever enough to think up of an undesigned coincidence and were able to insert such a thing in the text, it would be of no benefit to them if the coincidences are not discovered for generations or was never discovered. There would be a great temptation for the writer to draw attention to the coincidence. That kind of attention drawing is what we would expect from a forger or somebody writing fiction. But there is one more undesigned coincidence here in the story. Numbers 16:25 through 34 tells us how that rebellion turned out. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well. It reads, "Moses got up and went to Dathan and Abiram, and the elders of Israel followed him. He warned the community, 'Get away now from the tents of these wicked men. Don't touch anything that belongs to them, or you will be swept away because of their sins.' So they got away from the dwellings of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Meanwhile, Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at the entrance of their tents with their wives, children, and infants. Then Moses said, 'This is how you will know that the Lord has sent me to do all these things, and that it was not of my own will. If these men died naturally, as all people would, and suffer the fate of all, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord brings about something unprecedented, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them along with all that belongs to them, so that they will go down alive to Sheol, then you will know that these men have despised the Lord.' Just as he finished speaking all these words, the ground beneath them split open. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed them and their household, all Korah's people, all their possessions. They went down alive into Sheol and all that belonged with them. The earth closed over them, and they vanished from the assembly. At their cries, all the people of Israel who were around them fled because they thought, 'The earth may swallow us too.'" Yikes. It just isn't safe to mess around with Moses. This very sobering story brings about another undesigned coincidence. Compare this with what we read 10 chapters later. In Numbers 26, 9 through 11, we read, the sons of Eliab were Nemuel, Dathan, and Abiram. It was Dathan and Abiram chosen by the community who fought against Moses and Aaron. They and Korah's followers fought against the Lord. The earth opens its mouth and swallowed them with Korah when his followers died and the fire consumed 250 men. They served as a warning sign. The sons of Korah, however, did not die. Wait, so what now? Hold on a second. The sons of Korah didn't die? I thought we just read in number 16 that the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them, and their household, all Korah's people, and all their possessions. Did the writer of Numbers get sloppy and contradict himself? Before we jump to conclusions and play the contradiction card, let's inspect Numbers 16, 25 through 27 a bit more closely. It reads, Moses got up and went to Dathan and Abiram, and the elders of Israel followed him. He warned the community, get away from the tents of these wicked men, don't touch anything that belongs to them, or you will be swept away because of their sins. So they got away from the dwellings of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Meanwhile, Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at the entrance of their tents with their wives, children, and infants. So what exactly is happening here? Well, as a Levite, Korah pitched his camp closer to the tabernacle than the other tribes. The Levites formed 3 sides of an inner square, while the other tribes formed 4 sides of the outer square. So Korah's tent would be some distance away from the dwellings of Dathan and Abiram, both of whom were of the tribe of Reuben. Therefore, it's probable that the sons of Korah lived far enough from the devastation that struck others, a disaster that we know was limited in scope since God gave Moses the commandment to get away now from the tents of these wicked men, don't touch anything that belongs to them or you will be swept away because of their sins. Many translations of verse 32 of Numbers indicate that it was the men who were affiliated with Korah's rebellion that were swallowed up. Whether that means his dependents or those partnering in his rebellion isn't totally clear from the Hebrew wording, but it is clear when we look at the full picture. So in the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram against Moses, we've seen 2 examples of undesigned coincidences. In the first, we are told that the family of Kohath and the family of Reuben lived on the same side of the tabernacle, allowing them to conveniently conspire against Moses while living there. Then we also have the indirect mention of Korah's sons being alive in Numbers 26, the implied omission in Numbers 16:27 of Korah's sons being present at the place of destruction, and our knowledge of the position of Korah's tent relative to that of Dathan and Abiram. The subtlety and casualness where these seemingly unconnected passages fit together as they do is a mark of accurate history. Thank you so much for watching, and if you found this kind of content helpful, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this video.
You could slow down a little bit.
This is kind of fast.
We put it on.
minute faster than I can listen.
Yeah. Faster than you can process.
Almost.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's interesting, you know, just, and I think that's true of a lot of places in the Bible where, you know, there are things that don't make sense until you really, you know, put things together, like the good analogy pieces of a puzzle that, and how, I thought that was interesting, just that, you know, if somebody was trying to forge it, you know, they would have made it more clear. And remember that, you know, you were writing a good history story. So, well, I think we'll stop there today then. As we know, they got swallowed up. And,
Big old hole, was it?
yeah, it was like, I mean, you hear about, you know, sinkholes like in Florida and stuff like that. I think this was a supernatural one because they're closed back up right away. And, I mean, some have speculated they went right to Sheol. But as we're going to find out, it
Actually,
did,
what the scripture says.
yeah, right? In the bad side of Hades, yeah. But then we're going to find out too that unfortunately the next day the people wake up and they say, "Hey Moses, what's with you? You know, you killed God's people." Really? So
There was one case where you can take it with you. You sure it got burned up when it landed where it was.
yeah, and of course there's another judgment coming too, which we're going to read about.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you for coming, and we got 2 more Wednesdays, and then we'll be done for the summer. And then we'll probably go into Deuteronomy, and so thank you. So we keep in prayer our friends, church members.